I'm Yashwant Thegde, presenting you a subject on Introduction to Cloud Security. Cloud security has been one of the biggest concern across today, as many of the things that we use are going live, and we are bound to have a risk that comes along with it. Your email, your chats, and many other things which you are interacting online are all subject to risk based on where it is and what it happens. This session covers an introduction to cloud computing service model and the risk that it carries along with it. The most important being that the privacy is a bigger concern when we host our data on cloud. The session also tries to address a few things which would help a customer or somebody who would want to go to cloud, some of the things which they would require to make note of. Now, what is not covered? In this session, as it is just an introduction, I don't intend to cover anything related to risk mitigation or securing the deployment or any detailed case study on threats or security breach. It's an overall discussion about the different models and the risk that it carries and how we can look at or what we should be looking at when we go around hosting it. The expected audience for this are somebody who would want to move to the cloud professionals and aspirant to get into the cloud domain, students, infrastructure management professionals. Let's begin with why cloud? With the business demand, business are forced today to look at solutions which are cheaper and which are dependent on other service providers. It's an ecosystem that has pushed every one of us into the cloud domain. Now, business dependency on internet has grown. Your bank account where you would visit earlier and stand in the queue and get this are now resolved through online statements. Now, this happens through various networking systems and computing resources behind the scene. A bigger things, you today buy businesses, you today buy commodities online, and that's where the dependencies on cloud has grown. And all the organizations who are into e-commerce, banking, businesses are adopting the technology. Being this, is it secure is always the concern. There are people who are worried about getting their credit card transaction executed online, giving their card IDs or CVVs. Let's look at it. What are the risks in the going sessions, but today with some introduction to it. What are the advantages if you are getting into cloud? It's definitely a zero or low startup capital expenditure. The customer or the consumer who would want to use the cloud services would not require anything to invest or a very little to invest in the initial days. With a lot of startups and companies that are coming around, this is the only way where they can quickly get and jump into the business. The biggest point here is pay as you use. This is the most beneficial part of cloud advantages. And with deployment and availability, it's very important you would go to market as early as possible. Now with cloud, you don't need to set up your infrastructure. If you just rent it out or procure online, that gives you the benefit of going early to the market. What makes cloud most important? Why was this cloud all about became important in the recent is that with a lot of hardwares and people demanding go green, it was important for organizations to reduce their power consumption, utilize their infrastructure efficiently. That's when the virtualization and advanced technologies, which are like containers, came into fact, and that gave a big scope and mileage to get into the cloud businesses. People have invested huge, like Amazon Rackspace, on the cloud deployments, and they provide services with a little or less cost to the consumers who would want to hire these boxes from there. Overhead of maintaining this entire system by not having a system administrator in-house and not being technically competent is one of the advantages which has pushed for cloud computing. Customers today look at cloud computing to avoid problems of maintenance or the huge cost that it attains with having a huge investment beyond the hardware which gets depreciated shortly. It's interesting to know that some of the early cloud statements which were given by very popular corporate heads include a statement like this: I don't understand what we would do differently in the light of cloud computing other than change the wording of some of our ads. In fact, this is what exactly I felt when I just looked at this cloud as early as around 5 6 years beyond. I just thought it's another way of pushing things to the market. The other gentleman said, I have not heard two people say the same thing about it. There are multiple definitions out there of the cloud. So this is, though, a very true. It was very true long back, but yes, there are few definitions and strategies put behind. But still, this confusion is always a bit being left behind. This is a very famous statement by one of the developers. It's stupidity. It's worse than stupidity. It's a marketing hype campaign. This is what was told when they coined the term like cloud. Now, looking at this, what was told long back, and looking what we are today, it is obvious that there is probably no future without moving into cloud or without not having cloud taken seriously into your business domain. Let's get a little detail about what does cloud definition mean as per NIST. The cloud computing is a model for enabling ubiquitous, convenient, on-demand network access to a shared pool of configurable computing resources. Let's not get into the detail of reading it. What it means is your network, servers, storage, application, and services are all available online today. You'd only pay for what you would use and utilize these services. They can be rapidly provisioned. You don't need to ask your system team or IT team to keep them ready so that you can go ahead inform him. And this avoids a lot of time. This saves time and also puts things in place. You can quickly go around, push them to the system, and get it provisioned. Now, the most important of all is cloud model. 5 essential characteristics, 3 service models, and 4 deployment models are being identified as a requirement of a cloud solution. Let's look at essential characters. Cloud supports on-demand self-service. That is something which you would go and demand and use it as and when you want. Broad network access, you can get into different domains and get multiple resources. Resource pooling, you can utilize your existing resources, pool together and rent it out for customers. It's all about using multiple services in a single place. Rapid elasticity, as your business grows, you can always grow quickly and put things into place for your customers downline. Measured services. What makes very important about essential characteristic is all about measured services. Now let me just put this fact a little more in detail. Now, while virtualization was always there, it was doing many of these things of the 4 which was listed above. Now, with measured service, this is where the cloud stood different from virtualization. It was all about measuring what is used and charging back the customer for its usage. While these essential characteristics were addressed, it was important to have service models. What do you give in term as a service with the resources what you have? It was classified and identified. Infrastructure, the most biggest concern of many small organizations is deploying solutions on their own hardware. The hardwares were costing huge. A server was not less than anything around 1.5 lakh to 2 lakhs at minimum. And things were very difficult for a small company or a medium-sized company. Now, when this cloud companies came up, this was one of the biggest advantage which many of the companies looked at, and they were able to hire this infrastructure from the companies which were providing it. The second was about having a platform built on this infrastructure. Now, having an infrastructure was the first solution, which was quickly made available to the resources. But what do you do then? It's important to have some platform. A platform can be anything, any application which would support your environment or business. It can be a environment for a software development company. It can be a solution for an organization which can put their entire middlewares in the system. Software as a service is the last part, which is very popular. You might have seen that Office 365 and many other services which you would utilize online without owning them or having them in with you is what is software as a service. Software as a service helps you quickly log into the system, utilize the services of that software, make your presentation, documents, spreadsheets, whatever it is, and then exit out of it. You can also have your invoices billed online. You can have your businesses running online with the softwares which are centrally hosted and pay as per your use. These are 3 basic service models which were identified and been very popular in the recent trend. The deployment model, now infrastructure, platform, and your software as a services were made available. Now, these were possible to be deployed in various ways. Now, Now, one was making it available for public so that anybody from any portion of the world just logs into your system and utilizes the resources what you are offering as a service. The second one is you just have a big farm of hardware and you just deploy your solutions onto these boxes and help ensure that your internal team uses this so that the hardware is fully utilized and is efficient in its usage of the CPU, memory, or other resources which are attached. When private and public are very clear definition of what it is, while public allows any public to get access to it with a required subscription or pay-per-use, while private, on the other side, private had an option to configure your own in-house systems which could be accessed by your team or your own resources who were working for you or associated with you. Now, the mix of this two, public and private, was something which was coined as hybrid. Now, companies which were building software, they always had a big demand of load, which was pushed onto the machine, while their resources could not take this. Now, what happened during this period was the companies identified this demand, and while the private organizations or the companies which had computing resources for the best what they could do were always used for their in-house development and testing. Especially this was very important during testing phases. With hybrid, people could test to the limit what the resources they had, but then when they wanted a bigger testing or bigger use cases to be built, they had connect with public cloud. The integration between a private and a public cloud done through interfaces is called a hybrid cloud. The hybrid cloud consists of your in-house cloud deployment connecting to the private cloud deployment, wherein you can move your images or setups to the public cloud for a bigger usage. Now, the fourth one is a bit tricky, which is again said as community cloud. This community cloud is nothing but a group of similar industry association had come together and defined a definition saying that, if we are together, we can invest low and share our resources which are used for the same purpose of business. So the community cloud are built for a specific purpose of the business, wherein which it stands little better than your public cloud and hybrid cloud, but not as safe and secured as private cloud. The community cloud were built for people who had a very similar business approach, algorithms, and ideas for deployments. Let's say a university would join a couple of colleges and put them on cloud on their network. A couple of universities can join together and put their solutions onto a single administration view boards. So these are few deployment models which are again very popular and available across the system today. Now, what makes this cloud so important, and how is it different from having a resource that is in-house? There are two things which are very important. One is about managing the cloud. The second is about managing your infrastructure. Now, is it different? Managing the cloud is something that happens online with a web interface or an application given for the purpose. Now, the resources are somewhere which are not visible to you, and you may not know where they are, subject to your SLA and agreement. Now, when this happens, there are two options where you would take control of managing them directly using the interfaces provided by the service provider, and then take control of the deployment of what you would want to utilize the resources which you have rented for. The second is allowing the service provider to do everything for you, and you just deploy the solution what you want to be available for your customers down the lane. There is no much difference. If you have a skilled resource in your in-house, you would do the same thing within your hardware boxes with a little more comfort of doing anything what it requires immediately. But on cloud, you would require a little more skill than what you would have done in-house. You need to learn their interfaces. You need to learn how they have put their business interfaces for access to you, and be aware of it. This is where the certification courses or anything that comes in place. Amazon, Rackspace, or a couple of them, OpenStack especially. These are all cloud solutions which are available, which requires a little more skill than directly using a hardware boxes in your house or in-house. Now let's get into a little more than introduction. Now, what are the risks with different deployment models? Now, when we talk about security, the security is always important with terms in respect after considering the risk of that particular business. If you identify what is the risk, then probably you would put a place and a container to ensure the security of that particular risk which you see. The risk can be in terms of business, or in terms of hardware, or in terms of networking, or in terms of security, sorry, storage, and many such things. Let's understand, while we had different models and maintenance is looked at, let's see what in-house deployment does. This in-house deployment is something where you have your applications directly hosted on your premises and accessible to your own local team and administrator. Now, the risk what you see is your ISP internet services, service providers connectivity. Now, is that a risk? If it is a downtime, you would have measured it and you would have taken it. These are accepted risks. If the network is down, you would lose your business. The risk mitigation would be to have a backup line or a secondary line and go about it. The servers, storage, network, firewall, virtual machine application, whatever you would install inside your in-house will be available for control within your premises, and you are the boss of that location. You might have uh, hardware and many things installed and maintained within your premises, but you would not have the skill set to control this or manage this. So what you would do is you would hire some expert who would sit at a remote location and connect to your premises and then manage your servers, storage, network, and firewall. These are all on-premises managed services, wherein which the risk is always there. Risk is always there with these people who are identified for managing this are to be considered with little more caution and taken care of. While ISP remains common in all the platform, if you are going with on-premises managed services, your review of this personals who are engaged in the business becomes important to put your security plan and understand the risk that it brings in along with it. Virtual machine and application on-premise managed services would remain very similar. You would be in control of what you are doing and your applications are yours. Let's get into a little more on the cloud. With an infrastructure as a service, what you are utilizing is the ISP internet. Basically, your internet connectivity to the cloud is same, but again, the cloud service provider has his own ISP network with his backbones and multiple channels for delivery. He has his physical hardware deployed for solutions and a storage network and with firewalls. Now, the challenge here is there are always a risk that the service provider's network might not be accessible. The server may not be up when it is required. The storage or network or firewall may not be up to the mark. Saying this, many of the organizations who are providing these services are definitely taking care. But then, how good are you to be aware, or how much of information that they are maintaining is in your awareness becomes a challenge. Now, when this infrastructure as a service solutions comes in, you would go ahead and select an image and deploy your operating system for use. Now, these operating systems are left for your configuration. You would configure them, you would manage them, and you would take care. Now, again, you have a choice. If you have an in-house, you would allow him to do, or you would go ahead and deliver it to somebody else to manage your virtual machines as a managed service. Well, applications are generally something which is directly responsible for enhancing your business profits. Now, this is something which you would require to be in control when you put IaaS, when you use deployment models such as infrastructure as a service. Now, the risk here is, okay, though there, but more on the infrastructure is taken care. You don't have a bigger risks that you would have in your place of power failures, server going down, you do not have a backup. These risks are always mitigated going to IaaS, but the other risks of people not known to you who are managing it may add another block in your thought. The next model, which we have referred as a platform as a service. Again, you have ISP server storage. If you see this in a platform as a service, the application is also hosted on the customer place. He has control on it. The virtual machine is yours. Application is again yours, but he has given you the permission and he has given you the middleware which you are deploying it. Now, any failure of your middleware might end up with your application not accessible. So it literally means that your stack which you are deploying on, okay, the application which is deployed on becomes important, and its safety and uptime has bigger concerns on platform as a service. The last model, software as a service. Now here you don't have any control. You really don't have any control. The application is given to you. You are using it and you are bound to the behaviors what it demands from you for that usage. Now while this, you can see this diagram, the red colored which I have marked is all controlled by the vendors. In fact, the violet is controlled by your organization, and the amber is always a choice of organizational management while owning the system. You can outsource this and you can manage this. Now, what are the bigger threats that you see in today's world? It's all about the data. What is cloud? It's all about the data. How good and how safe is your data on cloud? When it comes to security, what are the three most important things that gets into the attention? We are worried if my data is maintained confidentially by the service provider. Is the data which I have uploaded is with integrity with what I have uploaded it? And bigger is it available when I want it? Now let's get this. Confidentiality. Now when you use somebody's service, you're always worried, would they maintain your data as good as what you would want it to be confidential? Would they leak this data to somebody? What happens if they peek into the content and use this data for their business benefits? This is the first consideration which you would be worried about if you're putting your content onto the cloud. Now, you would, in this case, you would identify the data, which is very important for you, but also with considering its confidentiality that it has to be retained in terms of your business demands, partner demands, and other ecosystems. Now, if you feel that the risk, after understanding the risk that you would come across on losing its confidentiality by putting it on the cloud, you would arrive at a decision whether it should go to the cloud or retain it. Integrity. Now, many of the things, let's assume that the confidentiality is taken care. There is no sneak or there is no much risk about the data being used by some third party without your knowledge. But then, is the service provider has the right resources where the data which is stored is always good and intact as what it is stored with? Now, this is where the integrity question comes in. It tries to address, does the data that I have uploaded be not tampered? What happens if it tampered is the biggest question which you would require to address. The tampered data can change the economics of the business. Let's consider a stock market which maintains its entire data on a cloud, and this data getting tampered with some changes in its value proposition can definitely change the economy of those investors who have invested on the stocks which they are dependent on. This is the bigger challenge where you have very less control on this. But then let's see how these are addressed in the coming slides. Now, all said is fine, but is it available when I want it? Is another challenge which we come across. What if I cannot get the data when I need access to it? Now, this being a case true, it is as good as you having a connectivity to it or the service provider allowing a connectivity or having a uptime at his resources when you want it. These are almost addressed. Availability is not a bigger challenge with the technology and the network growing in the country, and also the service providers' ability, such as bigger ones in the market. But then there is no guarantee that it would sustain the uptime forever. There are incidents the bigger players in the market have gone down for few hours, wherein which it has put risk to the customers who are dependent on them for this cloud solutions. The other thing that comes into the mind is when we look at availability, I have gone ahead and deployed my data into these boxes which are provided by the service provider. Will he sustain his business with cloud competition and bigger ones eating the smaller ones? Will this company which have gone, will it sustain its business? And what if he cannot, and if he would want to migrate my data to some third party? Now, what are my bindings to this third party, and what are the availability of this availability of my data to these locations would become another challenge. This is where you would look at your entire requirements in detail, in perspective, and in line with confidentiality, integrity, and availability of your data, which is in demand for you when you want it. Now, all said is fine. What about privacy? Now, this is nothing to do with cloud, but privacy is all about having it anywhere, anywhere with the data, what you do or whatever you have given up, whatever you have uploaded. It can be as good as your voter's ID data, which you have given to the government department or whatever, which is available for public. Now, is privacy compromised on cloud? Now, privacy of the customer who has hosted a solution on the cloud is one part of it. The other part is very important and very bigger aspect is that what about the privacy of the customer, of the service consumer? The service provider has given his box and you have gone ahead and deployed all the solutions. As a good customer, you have maintained it with all SLAs in line. As a service provider, he has ensured uptime. But for some reasons, the data which you have stored about your customers online is now into a bigger risk due to some attacks that may happen on the network of this service provider. Now, what happens with this data which is stored online if it is compromised? Now, is this compromised data can risk you? Will this compromised data can risk you is another concern which one has to review. There are incidents where the data such as credit card information or personal information which are related to a person's name, full name, nickname, address, and other residential information are compromised. There are also certain areas where the biometric are being compromised. Now, what we put down across personal identification information, one is all about your basic information which is commonly available, like your name, address, and other things. The PII2, that is personal identification information 2, is all about your biometric and something which is very unique with your physical existence. Now, if this too gets compromised, what happens to your business? What happens to your transactions? Can it be compromised is the bigger concern which the cloud consumers are always at thought today. That's being a small part. The privacy is different for different country, different culture, and the laws are different at different locations. The laws can have somebody, a country can have a law which says, anybody who is above 16 can use this, whereas the other country may say anybody above 18 is allowed to use this. While age becomes one of the factors, many other factors such as the ethnics and other things also play a bigger role when it comes to leakage of privacy. That is, leakage of your data, which is very confidential for that particular demography of the country. Now, this has to be identified with your business. If you are into a business and you have some data which goes online and you would require to store it for consuming it later, it's important to identify where you are storing it and what is the risk of this data being compromised. Now, the state laws today avoid you to store a couple of things permanently at your location unless there is a guaranteed updates saying that the data which you have uploaded are very much secure. Let's take the national project which collects the biometric data and also the residential data. They are very sure to have their data very highly kept secure, so they are not accessed. But then the question is, all the solutions that are put across today are good as of today. But this security, is there any guarantee that it would remain good forever? And if so, for how long? So there is no guarantee that any data which is stored online is secured forever. So it has to be reviewed on a regular basis. It has to be checked across various checklists that come across deployment solutions and then ensured for proper updates and maintenance. While privacy risks are understood, why do people still hesitate to move to the cloud? There are risks, there are challenges, but then is that all? Is that not there? Is that something which is not there with your in-house boxes? They are there. You might have a malicious insider who would work with you and still expose the data what you have. It's a little bigger when you go to the cloud, or more bigger than what it is in-house. But saying that there are risk mitigations and plans provided by the service provider, it is you who would decide what you want to consume and what you would want to put in. Now let's understand. What are some of the challenges to move to cloud? Complexity of cloud. That's something where we believe the cloud, what you see, is not in a single location. It might be spread across various demographic zones. It might be spread across various countries where you would not have any control or awareness of where it is hosted. You will be always at the mercy of your service provider to get connected to this data and get control as and when you want. I'd rather say mercy. It's something where it's a strong word, but I believe that unless your service provider gives you an access, you don't have other way to reach it. That's what I mean by loss of control. You are bound to lose this if your service provider is not up to the mark and doesn't have higher control on his implementation due to its complexity. The second thing is, as it spreads across various demographic zones, you're not aware of what bindings those countries where your data is stored will have on you if it is leaked in your country, or what bindings that it might bring you into legal custody if it violates any privacy laws of your location or the other place where it is hosted. The second point is customer control on cloud dependent as per standard terms unless reviewed with. So this is where we talk about it. Some of you who are already into the cloud might have observed that the SLAs and agreements are termed accordingly as per the convenience and need of the service provider. Now, this language which is used should be same in terms of understanding between the service provider and the consumer. The SLS especially, when they say 99.95 or 99.9, it should be reviewed thoroughly and uptime has to be calculated. The penalty clauses are to be understood explicitly in terms of the risk that you have arrived and what you would want to cover with. Now, this language, when put down in SLA and terms, are always, you should remember, in benefit to the service provider. Now, while you go to the cloud, some of this may not be as per your requirement or as per your commitment to your customers down the lane. This may require amendments or changes into the policies, which means that you would pay more than what it is normally charged. Now, the question comes, is it all worth that investment to go to the cloud, or should I have it in-house for my own deployment? It's just a game there. It's just something which one would require to review it, then take a call on whether it makes sense to go online with all the additional cost or have somebody in-house. But at the end, the risk is always there, whether it is in-house or on the cloud, to an extent what it is exposed with. The third point, what we have here is data retained with service provider. Now, when you upload this data, now many of them say when you exit out of their agreements or terms, or when you terminate your contract, the data will be suspended and removed from their boxes. So they are going to completely delete it, or they are not going to use it for anything. They are going to crush it. But there are incidents across where it is identified that some of the time when the customer exits out of the contract, the data is left behind for two reasons. One is the customer did not renew it and the service provider gave him a renewal option but did not bother to take. It's a lack of interest or ignorance on something or dependent on some third party who is managing it. This data which is available online where you have not renewed this agreement is always a bigger threat. And as there is no agreement, as there is no contract and agreement in place, this data is into bigger risk than something which you would be comfortable with the binding of an agreement which is valid. Now, data retained by service providers are always a question mark. Do they really delete it? Many times there are incidents where it is referred that the disks which are removed from the data center are being sold online, and this data had some of the customers' information. Now there are online trading that happens for the used disks and many places. This comes through a lot of big data centers. Though the governance and IT laws and policies are today stricter, and they are into severe penalties and punishments with this misuse, ignorance of any service provider's technical person may end up with something bigger risk if they don't have right security in place. Login and credentials. Now, this is another challenge which we see. Now, with your application and with your installations, you are very comfortable and aware of who has login access and what they are allowed to do with your installations. But then when you are hosting it on the on the service provider's network, what happens to this? You are visible to what you see. Does it mean that there may not be any backdoors to your applications because it's all managed, it's all maintained by the service provider? Now, this is another concern. Though the law bindings hold them not to do so, there is no guarantee. A malicious service provider can always get into anything of your business and sneak into your data and connect to it. So those are just the challenges, but then a proper review, a proper agreement, and then a proper understanding of your business needs and the cloud service providers' delivery models are very critical to get your system into a secured accessibility. While we continue, the other important aspect is about the policies that are maintained by the service provider in terms of your data security and their network management. Now, this is true with anybody. Your data is as good as you manage it and as good as you maintain it. Now, some of the service providers would give you a complete control to allow logins, allow connectivity, and also set the authorization and accessibility to your users. Now, with a bit of complicated dashboards or a bit of complicated configurations, unless you have a very highly skilled person, it might be a challenge to configure it thoroughly. Now, the policy is something which says, okay, fine. Now, I have given you an access. What would you do is your interest. Now, saying this is again dependent on the SLA. Right now, your SLA has something where you have agreed for risk, which you are bound to accept, and then you are paid for it. Now, this becomes a bigger concern. The service provider policy are dependent on the business models which you would look at them for your services, would also depend on deliverables what they have. Their policies are made for their benefits. At the same time, if you're not very keen, there might be a small gap which you might have little risk. So the only way out is to review it thoroughly, put your legal team into action, get it vetted, get it reviewed properly, and get it completely understood before you go live with your cloud service provider. The sixth, though not very important and related to security, the uptime becomes critical for the business. It doesn't have anything to do with security, but the downtime due to this, any distributed denial of attack, that is something where the server is kept busy, allowing the genuine users not to get connected is a bigger challenge. Just because it's hosted on cloud, there are a lot of eyes on this network. And just because there is a good business running on the cloud service provider and the competitors or many others who are with malicious intention can try to disturb your businesses which are hosted on third party if the service provider has a lack of security configuration. Now, this can bring a downtime. So your uptime commitment from the service provider is important, and the penalty clauses in case if you cannot maintain can also mitigate your losses to some extent, if not fully. Here you may observe that many of the uptime commitment would not give you anything in terms of revenue, but it would give you in terms of extended time limits. This is something which you may have to look at when you work with your service provider and see what is the best way you can manage in case of any downtime that happens on the security, that happens on the service provider's network. Many of the cloud service providers definitely have a good monitoring system, but how much of it is something which is visible to you and how much of it can give confidence to you through their graphs, dashboards, and other things do matter. Having everything but not having an in-house person to manage or look at it and take a decision is another risk. So you need to also ensure that the service provider gives you a very higher monitoring system with whatever best it could reveal what's happening with your data and what's happening with your network which you are connected with for your purpose. The eighth has a couple of things. When I go to a cloud, what happens? I have a old application which was working on, say, OS version X, but now I have X plus Y plus Y. Now, what happens to this? Now, this is the bigger challenge. Now, many of them are retained in-house without going to the cloud just because they are not able to give it online. Now, what is the risk that you see? You don't see any risk if you do not go. But some businesses would come ahead and say, we would provide you with the version, with the network, what you have. Now, let's understand the version and other support, what is committed is not by the source provider. Let's say you have an operating system X, which has been removed from the service packs, which has been removed from support, is being given to you as a support from your cloud service provider. You would only patch it to the extent what he has in control with. These are good to go with open sources, but any proprietary solutions which you would have used online and on cloud might have a risk depending on your cloud service provider's commitment to maintain them. So unless you have a strong uh, understanding about your operating system, understanding of your middleware, and understanding of your application, migration is always a challenge. Latency. Now, while I connect to my network, the business demands, say, response time within 3 milliseconds, 4 milliseconds. Would this be met always, every day, every time, is another thing which would put across. Costs and connectivity. Cost is something which we look at very much as a decision factor, which is dependent on many things where cost determines whether should we go to the cloud or leave it behind in-house. Let's understand the bigger risks than what we have addressed. You need to know that the cloud is nothing but pooling of resources. The resources have been put across and many tenants occupy them. Many customers are hosting their solutions on that. Any single breach into the network can damage all the customers who are there. We mean to say that single breach can cause a higher damage. Threat and attack due to the shared resources are always higher than compared to anything. Accountability and verification is something which is a challenge. You would not be very sure who is accountable in case if it fails, if you're not very clear about your SLAs, which you have agreed with. And verification of any logs or other things will always become a challenge. Now, these are few concerns which are always raised when we talk about moving to cloud. The other risk that come from multi-tenancy, every tenant who hosts solutions on cloud would definitely have their own goals and objectives, which might be against each other's. Now, this may bring in additional risks, especially on the security part of it, which might be overlooked many times due to the business needs which the service provider would want to achieve. Separation of tenants based on workload and businesses are the solutions which, unless you see that is being communicated or committed by service provider, this remains as a risk. Let's get into a little more about your storage. Accountability, customer or service provider responsible. Now, this is a question. Are you responsible? Are your service provider responsible for any breach? Is always a challenge. This again depends on what you have got paid for the services what you are given across. Communication link, is it good enough and encrypted between your location and the service provider, between your customer and the service provider's location? This becomes, is it encrypted or plain? Makes difference in the communication link. Risk from service provider aggregating data of various clients and analyzing it. So I know a case where a couple of those SMS service providers and other things are coming out and trying to provide this email IDs and mobile numbers for consumers to use to promote advertisements and businesses across. Now, what is noticed is this are aggregating these email IDs or phone numbers and trying to locate them geographically and distribute this for a small exchange of currency. Now, these are risks, especially that happens due to service provider. If he's into another business thoughts using your data, that might be a bigger risk for your entire business, which may put your business out of market if you're not competent and if you're not very much connected to it. Auditability logs and reports are always referred as the bigger concerns. If there is a threat and if it has been attacked and if there is a risk on that and a compromise, you have a very limited auditability. You have a very limited auditable logs or auditable documents or auditable reports or auditable connects to these machines. Now, logs and reports are always a paid services. Many of us ignore that just because it adds a few more dollars or few more INRs into the billing. So this is another important concern which we have to address. Logs and reports play a very important role which you have to enable or buy them if they are provided as additional service by the service provider. Many of the service providers don't allow you to conduct VAPT. That's because it might increase the load. Now, here is something which you have to look at and take a call. How would you mitigate this risk? Risk spread across different zone. Your data is somewhere in some other country. The processing happens. The CPU is utilized in some other country, and the backup happens in a different zone. While this is happening, there is no guarantee about where, when, what has been done. This is another risk which has to be looked at, understood in terms of what the service provider provides. Let us put this in a simple, small conclusion. What would you do if you have to move your solutions to the cloud? I'm sure you cannot avoid going to cloud, but then make sure that your agreements, SLAs, terms and conditions are reviewed very much before your decisions of moving them to the third party. Now, there is a saying, I would have my virtual private server, which is, in control with me completely. Now, this is something which is as good as saying yes, but no. You may notice that virtual private servers are also other part of deliverables that are happening from your service provider, which is hosted on a common storage or some storage which he has bought, a CPU which is being given to you. It is only dedicating or giving you the commitment of usage of that resource, but it doesn't say that it's the only boxes which are available. Saying that unless you know that the virtual physical server, if you're comparing it with which virtual physical server which is hosted somewhere else, then it makes sense. Again, dependent on the accessibility that has been given to their in-house team, and many other things come into the places. The most important for us or anyone who would want to move to cloud is to look at vendor certification. What is this vendor all about, and what certification does he carry? Does he come out, has he certified, has he got the certification across various domains that are now in market and are accepted across globally for any competent demands? Certifications include BS 27001, ISOs, HIPAA, Sarbanes-Oxley. There are certifications not directly related to HIPAA or Sarbanes-Oxley, but there are guidelines which says these are some of the things which has to be managed or maintained. Probably your business put across and reviewed across your needs in-house will help you to identify whether the vendor has the right certification for him. Risk assessment report is not at all shared by most of the service provider. Accessibility to it is definitely an advantage. If you can get hold of it, probably that gives you an insight of what's happening. Monitoring tools and support services, as referred earlier, are very critical for you to know what's happening. The other side, you don't have a technical team. Patch update and maintenance of your resources are important, which has to be ensured that they are done on time and you are not into risk because of any failure of the service provider. While cloud gives you a benefit of having redundant services, it might be remembered, it should be remembered that it also brings in additional risk of another place for threat. So redundancy can give you a benefit, at the same time add another risk point. The other challenge is your cloud service provider might be buying resources from another cloud service provider just to avoid cost. Now this, unless you are sure, or if the cloud service provider does not commit, you might not be aware of. It has to be discussed, documented properly, and then a decision has to be taken whether what happens to your data if it is moved to the third party with your knowledge or without your knowledge. And last but not the least, review authentication and access control. Now, authentication mechanisms and methods used by the service providers, along with what is allowed to access, becomes very important for you to know at any given point of time. These are few checklist which I have made for this presentation, and there are many more subject to your business demands that has to be looked at one-on-one. Let me quickly get through some of the cloud recent security breaches. The World Wrestling Entertainment, in fact, had lost 3 million wrestling fans' addresses, ethnicities, earnings. This was hosted on the cloud. In this presentation, I have given you the links so that you can always go ahead, read this online documents and see what it meant for these companies when they could not maintain the confidentiality or data which was being given as PII 1 or PII 2. There was a huge loss of fans' data, which put this company into a bigger embarrassment and also penalties. Dropbox is a big case where during 2012 it was attacked and the data was sold on dark web marketplace in exchange of bitcoins. National Electoral Institute of Mexico. This is something which is again a voter's ID was compromised. And the most unfortunate thing was the database was very poorly configured. And the worst part was the data was kept outside the country. which was not a legal solution for them. The electoral data was kept outside the country, which was a bigger challenge for this team to address as whatever had been the proceeding as of now. Popular social media company email address and passwords were compromised from one of the big social media and networking company, and they were sold in dark web. This is something which happened in 2012 and also again repeated to some extent in 2016. The links gives you more details. Saying that Apple iCloud, in fact, there were data, there were photographs and images, personal pictures which were leaked through Apple iCloud storages, which again had concerns to the users. Home Depot, this is one of the biggest compromise that has happened since, where it was penalized heavily. It had lost almost around 76 billion consumers' data, which was a big number as of today. Those people had given their details related to their personal identification and many more information which was required to do business online. Now, the judgment was that anybody who would claim on this were given a $2 minimum, and if they had any document of loss, they would be awarded with the actuals or anything as decided by the bench. Now, going to cloud is always advantageous, but without a proper review brings in more threats. The security is as good as what you are aware of. And this session is basically about helping you to be very clear about what you should be looking at and what are the threats of losing data online, especially in terms of the privacy laws related to your country and the country where the data is hosted. I have referred some of the URLs where you can definitely go and read more or refer some of the interesting cases to help you out understand what is critical in your business segments. Thank you very much. Have a good day.